Hey guys, welcome back to the Chad and Mel Movie Hour. We are going to be doing something that is the brainchild of Chad and we're super excited about, which is a deep dive into the Walt Disney archives, going back to the original, the hit that set it all off, Snow White 1938, and do a deep dive on all the classic Disney films. So this is going to be a very long and in-depth series. That being said, we have some show and tell, and then we'll get into some history and some animation and some mythology, and yeah, so cheers. Let's get into it.
That's right. So for my show and tell, very excited about this series, by the way. Of course, we had the Blu-ray. I always show my Blu-rays. This is the Diamond Edition. Get it while you can, as they always advertise them. Snow White Blu-ray set, which has like a bonus Blu-ray of a bunch of bonus content and special features, which were fun to revisit for this. And then I have, of course, the vinyl, which is
so beautiful.
I have this whole series of Magic Mirror vinyls that Disney did, where you open it up and ta-da, you get a whole, like, basically book, a storybook, with nice large pages, which I love. And, it tells the whole story. And then on the inside, you have the vinyl record. And then last but certainly not least is my prized Folio Society edition of Grimm's Fairy Tales, which, of course, has Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in it, which we both reread for this. But yeah, so, this was really enjoyable to revisit the actual fairy tale. Of course, it's short. We recommend everyone read it instantly because it's a masterpiece of literature and it's charming. So that was really fun to revisit. And you have show and tell for us this time, which I'm excited about.
I do. This is one of my prized possessions. It is a box set, and it is the 9 Old Men, which refers to the original 9 animators at Walt Disney Animation. And it's essentially a collection of flip books from each of the 9 OG animators. Ollie Johnston, Mark Davis, Ward Kimball, who has a big player in Snow White. And it's essentially just an individual flip book of each of their signature characters. So if you're into Disney, if you're into animation, it's absolutely beautiful. Is this bad boy, which has become, it's always open on my coffee table. It's absolutely beautiful. It's by Ollie Johnston and Frank Thomas. Say again?
Gorgeous.
It is really beautiful. And if you're a fan of animation, if you're a fan of Walt Disney history, it's just absolutely beautiful. I mean, it goes into every single movie in chronological order, shows you how they storyboarded, how they animated. It's absolutely epic. So it's really great to see how your favorite memories and childhood movies come to life.
So. Right. So Snow White is a 19th century German fairy tale. Brothers Grimm, of course, famously published it in 1812 in the first edition of Grimm's Fairy Tales. Tale number 53 it was. And I just love it. It was really, really interesting rereading it to think about the comparisons between all the adaptations, which I think most people are more familiar with than the actual fairy tale. And make the comparisons, like what they chose to leave out, of course, for the Disney family-friendly version, and then we'll explore some other adaptations. But what were your takeaways from rereading it?
I was struck, number one, by how dark it is, and obviously it's going to be darker in comparison to the Disney version. But more than that, I mean, it's the Grimm brothers allegedly wrote this folk tale or this fairy tale based on stories that they had heard growing up that had been passed down orally. And there's an article by a gentleman who actually suspects it's based on some Spanish history. There was a Spanish duchess who had kind of a fraught relationship with her stepmother. She was allegedly poisoned. So there were some similarities that he alleges may have inspired these oral traditions that then turned into the fairy tale as Grimm's brothers have, passed it down to us. But more than that, I mean, just right out of the gate, the entire plot is different from the way it starts to the way it ends. I mean, you have an introduction to Snow White's mother, which you don't get in Disney movies, and we can talk about that as well. But it opens very differently with this kind of prophecy that Snow's mother receives when she pricks her finger on a spinning wheel. And basically, she wishes for a daughter with white skin, red lips, black hair, etc. And so Snow White is born. And you do have the dwarves and all of that, but when you get to the stepmother, she actually makes 3 attempts at poisoning Snow.
Yeah, which I thought was interesting. I like the exploration of that, but I get, why you scale it back for an adaptation. It's more powerful if it's one time, and but when we were, what's interesting, a distinction is in the original fable, they don't say, so the queen wishes for a daughter who is white as snow, red as blood, and black as her ebony window frame, but not specifying white for her skin, which I just found interesting, like looking at it, because every adaptation says that she asks for a daughter with skin as white as snow, but
right.
It's way in the original tale. They do say, once she's born, where those 3 colors lie on her. But
right.
It's just an interesting little difference that's always changed in every adaptation.
I wonder if that lack of a direct reference to skin, that the white is more of a suggestion of innocence or purity.
Yeah, I mean, it opens it up more, and it's less about like that. It's more about the contrast and the extremes of those 3 colors, I think, than any specifics. What is the moral? And that article that we found on reference.com just sort of says that the moral of the story is that selfish desire is dangerous. So, of course, you have a vain and jealous queen obsessed with how she looks. And I feel like that is the most relevant story right now, like with, extreme filters and plastic surgery. And so it's really interesting. Like it's a very simple moral, right? But I think it's very powerful. And so I love that. The queen's vanity and narcissism lead to her downfall. She actually attends their wedding, and the prince and Snow White, once, at the very end, of course, get married, and the queen attends it. And of course, she's been in a jealous rage the whole time over Snow White. She ends up getting forced to, I guess, dance in shoes of steel, and they become like fire hot, and she's killed.
Yeah.
And it's wrapped up in one sentence at the very end of the fairy tale.
Right. It's literally one sentence that describes her death, and it's basically they force her to dance until she dies. I mean,
and that is never seen almost any adaptation, which is, it's really way more fantastical, right?
Yeah. I'm wondering if anybody who's watching this knows if that iteration, if that particular ending shows up in any of the film adaptations that might be lesser known or older. That'd be interesting. But yeah, also, the flip side is, Snow is very naive, right? I mean, in Grimm's, she's 7. In the Disney version, she's 14. So this is essentially a child. And so she's obviously going to be easily seduced by a delicious, beautiful apple, which would be a luxury item, as would a comb, which was poisoned. And the initial method by which she tries to murder her is to lace her so tightly inside of her corset that she suffocates. And in all three of these, the dwarves come to her rescue and try and warn her not to be naive again. But, you know, here we are. So, but to your point, like the simplicity of that messaging of vanity and jealousy and envy, I mean, it's elegant in its simplicity. That's why it's in fairy tales and it's in folk tales, and it's a foundational element of any mythological narrative.
You want to get into the Disney version of it and sort of the differences that they chose to do, and just kind of like how groundbreaking that version was as an animated film at that time?
Absolutely. So, I mean, we have to remember this was animated over 4 years and was released to the public, premiered to the public in 1938. So, this was not only the first feature-length animated film ever, but it's also one of the first film feature-length musicals. So you have a lot of things going on, and this is the first time that animation this technically advanced had ever seen the light of day. So for its time, and still today we could argue, it's absolutely groundbreaking and beautiful.
I'm just amazed that it is the first feature-length animated film, and what an accomplishment that was. And I was watching some behind the scenes stuff today, and they were saying, like, you know, all the investors, most people just did not think it could be a success. They said ridiculous things. And you see this repeated again and again throughout history with people who have vision that strong, right? That they know something, whether it was like Steve Jobs with the iPhone or whatever. This was like one of those moments where Walt just, he could see it, right? And it didn't exist yet, but he just knew it, that this could be as great as it ended up being. But people said hilarious things. They said, oh, the colors will be so like garish that people will like get headaches and walk out of the theater like, what the fuck? And people said, oh, you know, you'll run out of funny things to do because cartoons are just silly and they're not. And they had no clue about like how far he was about to take the art form.
Right.
So, I think they finally won over one investor by just like putting this presentation together and showing it in a series of more or less like stills and storyboards, with Walt like very excitedly acting it all out for him.
Yes.
They couldn't read him, but in the end he was like totally convinced, and he was like, right before he drives away, he just said something to them like, you know, you're going to be very wealthy off of this. Yeah, the rest is history.
Yeah, to your point, Walt, all of his animators, both his contemporaries and those that have, you know, followed him, have all said and stood by the fact that he was, at the end of the day, at his core, he was a brilliant storyteller. And, you know, much like we talked about with Ridley Scott, you know, you have a man who was an animator, an artist in his own right, and was able to do these storyboards himself. He did a lot of the voices. He had essentially, in The Illusion of Life, they talk about how before any animation had happened, before any music or dialogue had been recorded, he had the entire thing mapped out, like you said, storyboarded, presented every scene of the movie to his animators. And he was inspired by having seen the live action version that came out in 1916, which I would love to see. But yeah, he was, he is notorious. Walt is notorious for, you know, saying, this is what we can do, figure out how to do it, I'll figure out how to get the money. And by the time they were like, I think a year out from release, he had spent over $1 million. He had his house on the line. They were broke. And then it was one banker at Bank of America who said, I'm going to give you the extra $500K because this movie is going to change the world.
Yeah.
I mean, how epic is that?
Yeah, and of course it ended up being, you know, one of the highest grossing films, the highest grossing sound film at the time. An honorary Oscar was given to Walt Disney, and as you pointed out to me, I guess 7 little ones, right, to represent the 7 Dwarfs.
Yeah.
Presented by Shirley Temple, who was also at the premiere. I was checking out some footage from the premiere earlier today.
Star-studded.
Lucille Ball was there, like Lucy, an icon, of course. Shirley Temple was there. Marlene Dietrich was there, who I love. Yes, very star-studded. Walt was looking very dapper and handsome. And they had the Dwarves there. They had a very early Minnie and Mickey there, and just really, really kind of cool. It would have been amazing to have been there. Yeah. And also, like, how much would this film have blown your mind in 1937? Like, The Wizard of Oz was still 2 years away from coming out. When you think about the 30s, like approaching the late 30s for a film with animation this advanced, it's really mind-blowing. And even rewatching the Disney version for this, I was just blown away all over again by just even there's the scene where they're all washing up for dinner, right? And you have the soap bubbles, which are almost like iridescent. And the way that they pulled subtle details like that off, which are kind of complex, actually.
Yes.
A time period, the way water moves and how influential that it has become, which you pointed out to me. Just stuff like that is just so impressive.
Yeah, we talked about the water a little bit offline. The shots of the waterfalls, the iridescence of the bubbles. Just, I mean, you see almost that exact stuff in modern Disney animation too. So, I mean, it's a testament to how technically prowess these animators were.
This really was like a blueprint for them, because we even discussed how, how Snow White doesn't have a mother in this film, and how that motif was, of course, in the original source material, but became something that Disney was really kind of known for, and became a repeating motif through a lot of their films.
Yeah, I mean, the narrative trope of Disney princesses not having mothers has since become famous as just kind of like a narrative shortcut. But it's interesting because according to Grimm's, the source material, she did have a mother. So Disney made an executive decision that set a precedent for pretty much every princess movie to date. And you had mentioned earlier that all of these people, there's all this press and all of this just kind of negative just shadow cast on the production, that nobody would ever sit through a movie, a cartoon that's an hour and a half long. And there was even an article that came out before they had even started animating anything, called Disney's Folly. And the guy later then came out and said that he should have put his foot in his mouth. And the movie grossed at its time $8 million. And if you consider that the price of a movie ticket was 20 cents, that's the equivalent of like $15 million today. And at the time that it premiered, that movie had been seen by more people than any film up until that point, which is absolutely mind-blowing. Mind-blowing.
And they carry over a lot from the original story for this movie. There's so many super iconic elements, like ingredients to the story, whether it's the poison apple, the magic mirror, the in the Disney version you have the wishing well. There's so many of these like amazing iconic things that are in this film. I just love it.
Just kind of the iconography that you just referenced with the wishing well. I mean, okay, iconic, right? Like even when you go into Disney parks, there's a wishing well next to the castle. Okay, it's part of the mythology. And Snow White set another precedent for these princess movies and just early Disney movies, animation movies, of the kind of storybook page prologue, where you get like the little intro on the pages, and then you have the beautiful orchestral music in the background. And it's interesting because I learned through this Illusion of Life book that Walt actually had his animators go and sit in and study with professional fairy tale and folklore book illustrators to come up with an aesthetic that would look and feel like a fairy tale on the screen, which I thought was very interesting.
That's amazing. That's a great example of something that maybe wouldn't be done now, like an extra step that someone could take to ensure richness of content.
Yes, and it's, I did not realize this until watching the like this little kind of mini documentary about the making of it. But before they ever animate anything, or at least at this point in time, they had to have recorded all of the music and all of the dialogue so that the animators could then animate to, to the rhythm, to the dialogue, etc. So it was years into the process before anything like anybody started drawing anything. And just with the music production, there were originally 28 songs written for the movie that Disney himself edited down to the ones that made it in. The iterations of Snow White and the Queen, and like the design and the look went through many iterations until they finally arrived at what they did. And that was because they did this, they would bring in live actors to act out the scene, specifically the sequence where Snow's dancing with the dwarves. And also they had a male actor that actually came in and live acted the evil queen when she's in witch mode. And
That's
yeah,
amazing.
it's crazy. And so that also set a precedent for Disney animation, because they've done that with animals and actors, up and to now. It's still going on. But yeah, I mean, the iconography of the apple, the wishing well, the castle, and the dwarves. Let's talk about the dwarves.
Oh yeah, and Castle, that's a good a great one as well. Yeah, and such a like such an empire of Disney and the parks were like built using this as such a foundation, right? In part, but
Right.
a big part of the foundation of that whole Disney empire, I feel like, is this film. So amazing. And when you said that the animation was based on a male performer for the evil queen, that's so amazing, because I always think of a lot of the Disney like evil queens as like great fodder for like a man or a drag queen to take on that,
Yes.
like everything from Ursula to even Maleficent or something like that. Just these like really over the top, stunning, somewhat glamorous, like diva type roles, right?
Yeah. Ursula was modeled after the infamous, may she rest in peace, drag queen Divine.
That's so.
So yeah, they're definitely taking pages from each other. The drag community taking from Disney, and Disney taking from the drag community, which is absolutely beautiful. Um, and in the book that I was referencing, they make mention of a movie called She, but it starred a woman named Ellen Gahagan. And if you see her, she's literally dressed as the queen, like the same headpiece. I mean, just same bone structure. So they clearly took a page from that, because it's pretty uncanny. But let's talk about our favorite 7 unwashed old men.
Yeah. So my two favorite are, I would say, Grumpy and Dopey, because I feel like they're such a great yin and yang. They're almost polar opposites, but they're stealers in a lot of ways. You know, uh, Dopey gets a lot of great moments, like when they're washing up with the soap bubbles coming out the ears, and when they're in the mine with the giant gem eye and stuff.
Yes.
And of course, Grumpy, like I just love his the performance of that actor, and he plays like, a more, for lack of a better word, ignorant type of guy,
Right.
where women are evil, blah 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 blah, and he's a great like foil, I guess, in a way, for the other characters to point out how silly that thinking is, which I think is great.
Right. It's brilliant, and that's a testament to what great storytellers they all were, but specifically Walt, because that's one of the things that came up in this documentary and also in the book, is that these people that were naysayers were like, we're going to literally watch an hour and a half of like cartoon gags, because that's, you could do 10-15 minutes of gags in a short, but so they had the the foresight to understand that they had to incorporate drama. There had to be a hero's journey. There had to be protagonist, antagonist, and a balance of emotion and humor. And I learned that one of the 9 old men who worked on Snow White said that Walt used to pay them $5 for every gag that they would animate. So he was talking about how there's a particular moment where Dopey kind of falls out of step in line with the other dwarves. He's in the back and he kind of does this like little half step or little skip. And Walt, it was a mistake, and Walt liked it so much that he made that canon. So every time you see Dopey walk, he'll take a few steps and then he has like this hitch step or half step.
I feel like it's really personal for people, and people express themselves by who they relate to with the dwarves. Like it's very much like a reflection of them. I mean, I don't feel that I'm those two characters necessarily. I just find them the most enjoyable to watch. But I think there's a lot of relating to the characters that goes on in the Disney fandom. I have 2 facts that just blew my mind. One, that Charlie Chaplin praised Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs as a huge achievement at the time, of course. So we were talking about how star-studded the premiere is, and you have all these incredible icons of the day praising and loving the film. It also inspired MGM to produce The Wizard of Oz, which I had no idea.
That's crazy.
Whether they were going to or not, I guess this pushed them to make The Wizard of Oz. So, like, you're welcome.
Right? And we know that the production of Wizard of Oz was very dark and wrought with lots of horrible things and traumas. And in rewatching Mank, they reference like just how horrible that production was for everybody. So it's interesting that that the need to compete with Disney probably fed into that. To your point about the dwarves, yeah, I'm equal parts grumpy, sleepy, and Doc. Okay, that's me. But like what you're saying, who I most find endearing and charming is definitely Bashful. And you love Dopey, but I love Bashful. He needs his own spin-off as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
And then we got to talk about some of the names that got workshopped for the dwarves that got the axe.
Please do.
Like Sketchy, there was Lazy Daisy, there was Scratchy, there was Ditzy, there was and the final edit was Walt. Walt decided on the ones that we know and love.
Was Shifty one, or am I making that up?
Oh, no, Shifty was one. I forgot about, I would have liked to have met Shifty.
Hilarious. It's so funny. But in terms of our favorite scenes from this film, from the Disney version, I'll just say, like, when the musical number where they're all in the cottage together, and I think Grumpy is playing the organ, or the pipe organ, and all the little things are opening and closing on the pipes to make the different musical notes, and they're all kind of dancing, and then there's this wonderful joyous moment where Snow White just bursts into song with like a high note, and it's so like, it just feels so natural and like beautiful, and just that scene is just so like incredible and endearing, and then it kind of like naturally like slows down afterward and just lulls you into this like peaceful state that I was not prepared for, but I really enjoyed. And just for a film this old to still give a modern day audience the feels like that is pretty incredible.
Yeah. The scene with it's very early on where Snow is looking down into her reflection in the wishing well is beautiful, and it harkens back to the way that they animate water and light is just absolutely stunning. I love the forest sequence where she's running through the haunted forest and then ends up in the enchanted forest. The transition is beautiful.
Yes.
And the way that it's very psychedelic, the way when she's in the haunted forest that, you know, the branches come alive, the vines turn to snakes, things form eyes. Walt Disney Animation pioneered and patented this multiplane animation camera. I'll insert a clip of it. They have a full scale of it at the Walt Disney Family Museum in the Bay Area. But essentially what it is it's separate, different panes of glass that the animation is painted on, and they're stacked, you know, at a distance on top of each other, and then the camera is aimed down over it. And what it does is the panes of glass can move together, apart, and also, you know, so you get depth when you manipulate that for the camera. And the multiplane camera was not fully like ready and in production while they were filming this. So they went back and did 2 scenes with the multiplane camera, and the only one that I know of was the scene in the dark forest where she collapses in fear on the ground, and she's kind of like this, and there's all the eyes behind her. And you see the camera push in, and you get that depth perception. So that's pretty badass.
Right. Whenever I think of the multiplane camera, I always think of Pinocchio, which was the very next film in 1940 that they did, which we will review next in this series. But I always think of the great scene where the camera's pushing in on the like charming town and like the town center, and you just have the hills and you have the background, you have the midground, and the way that they pull that off is like next level in that scene. So I never knew it started with Snow White though. That's amazing. Yeah. You mentioned the Wishing Well, and I just love her song. I just have a moment for that song because, you know, I'm wishing, and then the repetitiveness and the call and response of that song is amazing. Yes. The vocal in that is beautiful, and it's a magical moment. It is.
Yes, it is, and it harkens back to the theme of like longing and pining, and yeah, and even the song "One Day My Prince Will Come" is, I mean, obviously it's a classic. It's absolutely stunning. You were mentioning the scene where they're all having the party in the dwarf's house, and they're dancing, and Grumpy's playing the organ. The animation inside of the dwarves' house is absolutely stunning. The attention to detail that they chose to put in, whether it be like the actual pipe organs that you mentioned are like these little animal totems, and you have Grumpy's ass on the like little pedals, and his booty's going like this, and you know, the etching of their names in wood on their headboards or baseboards, and you know, little animals carved into the doors and the side of the stairs. It's that attention to detail that not just the movies have held true to, but we see that in the parks, and that's why people go to the parks, is because the theming and the attention to detail is just out, like there's nothing on earth that compares to it. And it really, it immerses you, and it's also just you have to sit back and take stock and appreciate like this one thing that you probably wouldn't see unless you happen to look down at like a random curb, but there it is, like this beautiful ornamental detail, you know. It's amazing.
Right. And you were mentioning the amount of detail that they chose to put in, and I love your wording there because it was a choice. And you would think, like, being under the gun and under the budget and under all those constraints, that you'd want to like ram it through and get it out quickly. That was not their MO of
right.
how they produced this at all. Thank goodness. And there were some stories in the behind the scenes stuff I was watching of the animators saying like, oh, this part, it's not really animated up to our standards. I'm gonna come in nights, weekends, I'm gonna sleep here, I'm gonna make sure that this part gets reanimated, and they would redo something if it wasn't up to par.
Yeah.
That level of dedication that I think Walt was inspiring from them. You know, he really like rallied them and inspired them and led them, and it's almost like they would have done anything for him. And That's real. It's just really admirable. The whole amount of attention and detail that really went into this and care.
The dedication, the blood, sweat, and tears that went in, especially before Disney was this empire, when this was all just a gamble and these people believed in it. I mean, it's absolutely beautiful. And, the some of my favorite scenes are also, and some of, I think, the most beautifully animated are the animation in the dwarves' mine, like the way that the kind of jewels are superimposed over like the matte painting and they really pop. And yeah, I think that's beautiful. Just the dance sequence, the amount of time and work that had to go into just Snow White and them dancing.
Yeah,
I cannot imagine. I can't imagine.
So charming. And now is a good time to touch on the dark ride at Disneyland and formerly at Walt Disney World, but now just at Disneyland. That's one of my favorite dark rides. I just feel like I love anything that dwells on like the more dramatic and dark side of things. And that really was like a thematically dark ride.
Yeah.
And I just love that. And you were mentioning the scene where everything gets super psychedelic because she's in the forest and she's scared and the trees become claws. They're clawing at her, the alligators, all that stuff. You experience all that in the dark ride too, which is so neat. And rest in peace for the Walt Disney World version of that ride.
Yeah, I mean, it ultimately closed down because it was deemed too scary to children. Now, listen, I was riding that ride since I was in utero. It's not scary. To lose that and Mr. Toads, who you are repping right now, like to lose these two iconic dark rides. Thankfully, Disneyland still holding strong on the dark ride game, but like that loss is really felt, especially when it's replaced with stuff that's like more modern and not as heavily like just steeped in history and nostalgia and I don't know. So it's a loss. It's an epic ride.
Yeah, and you and I have been really cognizant of those rides being phased out. When I would go to Disneyland or Disney World, I would just ride those rides like again and again and again because I was just wanted to like take in every detail and just enjoy them and like really relish the fact that I could do that because I know that they will continue to phase out those type of rides.
And it speaks to the simple, elegant beauty of simple storytelling. And you can't have a ride like, let's say, Ratatouille that's coming to Epcot, right? Like, you can't have a modern intellectual property like that with an antiquated ride system. I get that. So it's really a loss when you have these older stories that belong with these more antiquated ride systems, because they go together, and it's a sense of charm that just gets lost.
Absolutely. And, Maelstrom was my favorite ride at Norway in Epcot, which I know that Epcot is very near and dear to you and I both. We both love the concept and layout and attractions at Epcot. And it's a favorite for us both. And that was my favorite within the favorite at that park. And so that was the toughest for me. And not to mention it was replaced by something I'm not quite fond of. So that's an extra.
We don't need to mention them. That's a double loss too, because that was actually a ride that was steeped in actual cultural history rather than based on a movie or a cartoon. So that's a huge loss, I think, and a gross misstep on Disney's part. But
and I mean, we could go on forever about this, but I'll just say real quickly that I think the whole point of that park, Walt would say, was the appreciation of those cultures for American audiences who are typically not that interested, unfortunately, in other cultures. This was one that really inspired people to want to know more about other cultures and embrace them and the world to come together. I mean, the most beautiful thing ever, and then you're gonna like do that a disservice is so unfortunate.
Well, I mean, we have to mention Hi Ho, Hi Ho. It's an iconic song.
Yes.
And we talked a little offline about, is there a Mandela effect going on? Because everyone thinks it's hi ho, it's off to work we go, but it's in fact, it's home from work we go.
Yes. I discovered this because I don't know how, but I was watching the film and I kept waiting for them to say it's off to work we go. Like, because that's what everyone said when I was growing up. It's like, that's, everyone would sing that song and that's what they said. So this Mandela effect is real for me. But if you look up the lyrics, and when I watched it, all you hear is eventually they say it's home from work we go. Yeah, so they're going home. They're not going to work in the song.
I refuse to accept that. The other one is Mirror, Mirror on the Wall. Shall we talk about that for a hot second?
Yes.
Mirror, Mirror on the Wall is not in the Disney movie. It's Magic Mirror on the Wall. And in the Grimm's version, it's Enchanted Mirror.
Yeah.
Where did we get Mirror, Mirror? I do not know.
Yeah.
But here we all are. Oh, we have to talk about the fact that, like, the entire... most of the plot is like could finish in 20 minutes. Like, you have the beginning where it's like, okay, evil stepmother trying to kill Snow runs away. Okay, the end, you know, she's in a coma, true love's kiss. Okay, everything in between is basically her meeting these 7 dwarves who she's just trying to get them to take a bath. Why have these men never bathed? It's very confusing to me. It's very charming, but it's literally like 30 minutes of her trying to get them to take a bath, and they're trying to get her to clean and cook for them, which, you know, hey, everybody wins. But it's great. I wanted to bring that up because it harkens back to what you mentioned earlier about Grumpy kind of being the foil, and acting as this kind of curmudgeon, borderline misogynistic entity among the dwarves to comment on how ridiculous that behavior is. Because at one point he says, when they first discover Snow in the cabin, all females are poison. They're full of wicked wiles. I don't know what wiles, but I'ma get them. And it's just so, he's just so charming.
It's genius where Disney kind of recognized like what they had. They knew what they had in the Seven Dwarfs, so they really extrapolated those scenes and that element of the story, because in the original story, the dwarves are not that as big a part of the story.
Right.
And but I do love the original story. I feel that the original fairy tale is very, very short, but it also has enough plot points that it would really fill out to like a feature film really nicely. Like, you could really pad it out and really like start to layer in all those details and story to connect the dots. So I feel like just enough dots there to do that. But I also feel like they've never done a really proper film adaptation of this that is faithful to the fairy tale, and you know, that has a good budget, that's like really top of its game for whenever it comes out. We just never get that. And this film, or this story, has been adapted almost probably more than any other Grimm's fairy tale. I mean, there are just countless adaptations, probably because of the popularity of the Disney version, but just so many of them missed the mark.
I do want to say one more thing about Grumpy, because it's one of my favorite kind of just parts of the movie, but also speaks to what you just mentioned, which is just this kind of foresight, or this kind of intuitive knowing of like this narrative that they had, and that had this kind of commentary built into it, which, how conscious they were of it or not is a different conversation. But, you know, you have Grumpy as like the, you know, watch out for this woman. And then they finally, you know, she's finally getting these men to bathe. Okay. And, you know, he's making fun of them and saying, oh, she's sooner or later, she's going to have you in perfume and bows in your hair. And then they end up dunking him and putting bows on him. So they get a little bit of like revenge on Grumpy. But he then comes around to Snow's charms and ends up like lining up for a kiss with the rest of them, which I just think is absolutely precious. The dwarfs are interesting because in the adaptations, in some they show up, and others they don't. So let's get into it.
Right, and real quick before we get into it, I'll just touch on this. It's interesting how in the original fairy tale, it says that Snow White finds the cottage in like immaculate, perfect condition,
Right.
like clean. Everything is laid out just so. It's almost like the dwarves are like OCD people living there. Whereas when Disney did it, he flipped that completely. He said, you know, they need her to help because look how these men live, because they're just a bunch of guys that, like, if just a bunch of guys live together that weren't
right.
you know, tidy or whatever. And so it really works in the Disney version, but I just found that an interesting departure. Yeah, without further ado, let's get into some of the adaptations.
All right, let's start with the Grimm's adaptation, which I think is the oldest of the three we're going to mention.
This is, well, you call it the Grimm's version, but I think that's a good way to put it because it's almost the closest to the original Grimm's fairy tale of any adaptation, even though it's wacky and tacky at times. I feel like the first half is really rough in this film. It's on Amazon Prime right now. Mm-hmm. It's called Snow White. It's from 1987. So if you search it up on Prime, just look for the one that's 1987, and it's live action, and it was produced by Canon, which is this amazing film company that did, among other things, RoboCop and 12 different Grimm's fairy tales as live action films, including a Hansel and Gretel with Cloris Leachman as the witch that is just outstanding and incredible. Yeah. This one's a little bit rockier than that one. There's Snow White that they did. I feel like the first half of it really didn't quite work. And the music's not very good. The singing's not very good. But the second half of it, I feel like really works. Like there's things about it that line up with that original fairy tale, such as the queen going to trick her 3 different times until she succeeds,
right.
Which is the original fairy tale, not in the Disney version, but it is in this adaptation. And also the way that the queen dies at their wedding at the very end is like really interesting. So I think it kind of picks up steam if you can hang in there with it. It starts off rough though.
To your point, it's really frustrating because it had the elements of like a perfect, true to the original source material, but it didn't have the money, it didn't have the script, it didn't have the players, and it didn't stick. And it also reminds me of Tale of Terror, which you recommended to me, with Sigourney Weaver, who we love. She's your queen. Which came out in like the late 90s, I think.
It's more like early 90s, early to mid 90s. Okay.
That one was very interesting. It was, I think, more realistic. It starts off true to form. Snow's mother pricks her hand, prophecy, she dies. Evil stepmother. But the dwarves are not, there's not 7 dwarves. There's just kind of this band of misfits. Some are like regular dudes. Some are there. I think there's 1 dwarf. So it's a little bit of a deviation there. And the ending is obviously a bit different, but it's all in all, it's executed extremely well.
It is. This is probably, for many reasons, my favorite adaptation. Sigourney's performance, I feel she's the only actress that has done the Queen as live action and actually nailed it.
Yeah.
She completely nails it. She has a subtlety, she has a sophistication about her skills as an actress, where it never feels, she brings it to all extremes, but it never feels like, oh, come on, it's over the top, which you get on some of these other performances of the Queen. I feel like it's right on where it needs to be. And when she's the evil queen and she comes, to visit her with the apple, the costuming and the makeup is just so delicious and incredible. It was made in 95, but it came out in 97. So you're kind of right. It came out more late 90s. But my probably my favorite moment in the film is just her in front of the magic mirror, and when you see how she's reflected back, and her acting in those scenes is incredible. She goes from like glamorous to hideous, old, young, like, I mean, every emotion, like it just is, it's so transformative. And she moves so, seamlessly between those different types of like facets of her persona of this character, and it's just incredible to watch. Like, it's incredible to see someone have that range of as an actress. And I mean, she looks absolute, like, jaw-droppingly stunning in some of the scenes, and then like horrible in within the span of like a few minutes. And just the mirror is tricking her, it's lying to her, it's stroking her ego, it's doing all these, the play, they really expanded on that concept of, I think that's the first time from the ones we've seen where that relationship between the mirror and the evil queen was fleshed out this
Agreed.
month.
Yeah.
And I just love that. So that's my favorite aspect of this film.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. It is the most fleshed out relationship between her and the mirror, because we don't really know much about the mirror or the history of the mirror, how that all came to be. Tale of Terror also has one thing in common with the third and final adaptation, which we'll talk about, which is Snow White and the Huntsman, which is that in both of those films, the evil queen has a brother. And I'd be interested to know if anybody knows in the comments, like, at what point did her having a brother come into the narrative and why? The other thing that I really like in paying attention to in all of the various adaptations is the role of the huntsman, because there are slight derivations in each. So we know he ultimately, in all of the movies, he never has the heart or the will to actually execute Snow. So he kills a boar instead and tricks the queen.
You pointed out that one of the cool things about Snow White: A Tale of Terror is that she resurrects like her stillborn baby with,
right,
evil magic in that, and that's like extremely dark, right? You want to talk about dark?
Yeah, Tale of Terror, the whole subplot of the queen having a second baby that dies in childbirth and her pretty much using necromancy to bring it back from the dead is absolutely fantastic. We're here for that.
Yeah, I just want us to forget to mention that. Sorry.
Well, we can't. I mean, we cannot forget a beautiful detail like a reanimated fetus. Okay.
When it reveals the little fetus's hand, it's Snow White says, your baby died. You have to accept that your baby died. And she said, he is alive in this room. And she's holding, and the little hand comes up. It's great.
So good.
When we were talking offline about how religious this one is, Tale of Terror, it's got a lot of, Catholicism and old world religion in it, which I think kind of heightens it. I think that's like great fodder. I mean, everything from like The Exorcist to Rosemary's Baby, these things that weave in religion with these super dark tales.
Yeah, and in Tale of Terror, there is a very interesting scene at the end involving a crucifix and a crucifixion, an upside down crucifixion. So it is deliciously dark, a deliciously dark take on the narrative. And yeah, I love it. With Snow White and the Huntsman, which is the most recent adaptation, not including the sequel because that doesn't involve snow, but I actually really liked it for what it was. Obviously, it was not like a strong script. It didn't have like the strongest actors for those particular characters, but there were elements that I loved. I loved the visuals of the forests in that particular movie. Again, very psychedelic, very aesthetically beautiful. I loved Charlize's aesthetic as the queen, and I know that we disagree on this. You did not love that the mirror manifested into Mr. Goldman. I kind of dug that. I thought that was cool.
I like actually did like that as like a standalone concept. I just felt like we didn't need that because the mirror is already interesting enough as
Right.
like a mirror. So I would be more interested in that. Like you have to kind of weigh it. Like, do you want something new and different, or do you want the original thing if it's even more interesting than the new thing potentially?
Right.
So to me, I'm more interested in just exploring that original thing. Really wish we had a live action that was faithful to the thing. So they really went totally different, obviously, with this one, and they took it into a very modern format, which
They did.
so I disagreed with you on this one across the board.
It is not problematic, and they did like the very on trend for that moment thing of making Snow like this very Joan of Arc feminist hero who like puts on the pants and goes into battle. And they also give the queen a backstory, her and her brother a backstory, which I found interesting. But it also played to that same trope of like, you know, she's a scorned woman, so she's just exacting revenge on men, and Snow is, you know, a result of that, and Snow's the only thing that can keep her young and immortal. So I appreciated like the backstory, but it was very cliche.
Yeah, I just found it super cliche and like as well, and that just distracted me. Everything just distracted me from enjoying it.
Yeah.
It's less than a 50% on Rotten Tomatoes, so I think it just was very mixed. People were very mixed with it, and I think it's just not going to age well. And I didn't like the performances in it, but yeah.
The only thing that I wanted to say that I really did appreciate about Snow White and the Huntsman, because I'm fascinated with the Huntsman as a character, is that they kind of subverted the traditional ending, or at least the Disney ending, where Prince Charming kisses her, wakes her, you know, true love's kiss wakes her from her coma. In this scenario, her true love, her alleged true love, Prince Charming, not the guy to wake her up. That kiss didn't do the trick, but the huntsman's love for her, he gives her a kiss and he honors her and he says, you know, you're whatever in heaven, whatever. The huntsman kissing her is what is the representation of true love, which I liked that. I liked that subversion of the traditional narrative.
Well, that just reminded me of a point that I'd love to bring up, circling back to the original, because in the fairy tale, the prince is not a part of the story till the very, very end, where after she's already in the glass coffin, which, by the way, I forgot to mention that. How cool is a glass coffin?
We love it.
We love a glass coffin, yes. That's just another very iconic, amazing story. So he makes a deal with the dwarves to take her because he finds her beautiful. And this is in the original fairy tale. And as he's carrying her away by, you know, by horse and carriage, they hit a log or a bump, and it dislodges the apple from her throat, which I love that imagery. But she basically sees him and says, "Okay, let's get married," which is, of course, not realistic. And I love that in the Disney version, and then in many subsequent versions, but starting with the Disney version, they introduced the idea that she knew the prince a little bit. There was a meeting by the wishing well before, you know, and she was already kind of like you say, pining and wanting love, and had love at first sight, basically, prince, which I think is a really nice way, so that when he finds her later on, there's at least some backstory there.
Yeah. It's not just kidnap and statutory rape. There's actually there is a relationship there of some kind. Lest we forget she's 7/14. But speaking of, we love a glass coffin. Okay, that's how I want to go out before, you know, you cremate me. Just give me like a good week in my coffin.
With
but they even
lighting.
Oh yeah, contour on point. Yeah. The dwarves even say in the Snow White, in the Disney version, when she's in her deathless sleep, she's so beautiful even in death, they didn't want to bury her, and so they hold this quote unquote eternal vigil for her, and that's one of my favorite shots of the entire movie.
Yeah.
Is that sequence at the end where the dwarves go up to her coffin, they place flowers, they slowly back away, they take their hats off, and they kind of bow their heads, and then the camera pans back, and you have all the woodland creatures there sitting vigil for her as well. And in the documentary, or in the book rather, they were talking about how when it was premiering, people were sobbing at that scene, like out loud sobbing, because I mean, who could have expected a cartoon to be that moving? And that particular scene just seemed to like clinch the deal and solidify this movie as one of the greatest movies ever made.
That's amazing. I love that moment. And in the original fairy tale, there's a great detail in the wording that talks about, I think there's a quote from the dwarves where they specifically say that it didn't feel right for her to be buried in darkness, and or buried under the ground in black, or something like that, to that effect. And I just loved that wording because they were really honoring her and her beauty. The story is equal parts glorifying physical beauty, which I don't know how I feel about. And on the other hand, it's really warning against vanity and wanting to be the most beautiful, which is, of course, the queen. The only other reference my mind can think of for a glass coffin is Evita.
Right.
Eva Peron from Argentina was buried before she was displayed in a glass coffin for all the masks to come up and pay their respects to her. And that's the only other example I can think of. But how amazing is the concept of like a glass coffin?
It speaks to cultural relationships to death, and how corpses and bodies are displayed or embalmed or cremated, or how, whatever the ritual is around death. And, kind of it ties into like the kind of quasi-religious element, which comes in certain iterations of Snow White, like Tale of Terror. They're going to church, there's the crucifix, it's very Catholic, which would make sense for, the source material when it was written, what was going on in that part of the world. But even in the Disney version, we see Snow White pray. And it's one of 3 Disney animated movies where we see any type of reference to prayer. The Rescuers, and then I forget what the third one is. Oh, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Obviously, it takes place in a church. But it's just interesting to mention that Snow White does pray.
And it's you touched on something that I want to give you a chance to expand more on. But when you talk about different cultures that deal with death differently, and I think a lot of the more religious cultures confront it more, would you say? And a lot of Latin cultures celebrate it, even Dias de las Muertes. I'm going to butcher that, but the Day of the Dead. And, it's a celebration. And we would never do that in America, it seems like.
Right. Yeah, I think as far as like Christianity is concerned, and specifically Catholicism, there's a separation. There's this taboo, and there's this it's all very dark and heavy, and grief, and the expression of grief is just very like, I can't think of the word, like when you bottle things up, it's very like internalized, and like the West doesn't seem to have like very healthy expressions of grief, or like ways to deal with death and dead bodies, whereas a lot of Latino cultures and a lot of cultures in Asia and in Africa as well, will display the bodies. They will embalm the bodies and display them. And other cultures will celebrate, and it's a party. So to me, that feels like a more healthy relationship to death, although it seems kind of jarring to us when we see like a dead body propped up on his motorcycle that he died on. But you know, to each their own. But it still speaks to the fact that like there's less of a taboo around like death and the dead body than there is in like Western Abrahamic religions.
Yeah, I think you're dead on with all that. And it's interesting because you see a lot of memes, like you mentioned the guy on the motorcycle. You see a lot of like articles and memes that like are meant to be clickbait and shock, or just people willfully display their ignorance a lot of times here on social media with these type of things. And it's like, you know, it's only weird to you because it's different to you.
Right.
But if you really just think independently about these concepts, it's not that strange. And I agree. I think it's a, you know, in many ways it's more healthy to, you know, accept, celebrate, and embrace, you know, this natural thing that happens rather than shroud it in fear and religion and mystery and sadness.
Bring it back to Snow, you know, the idea of encasing her in, you know, displaying her and encasing her in a glass coffin, you know, at once is, you know, to reinforce the fact that she's this pure, virginal, extreme beauty, youth, like the embodiment of everything that's supposed to be the ultimate ideals of femininity and womanhood. And at the same time, it's also, there's something really beautiful about the way that Disney showcased that, because it didn't feel exploitative in the Disney version. It didn't feel like, you know, rapey or gross or like, you know, it felt like she had this beautiful relationship with these 7 men. They took care of each other and they recognized her innocence, and her beauty was in her innocence and in her white, you know, her being white as snow, her being pure. And of course, that's why she ended up in that coffin, because she was so pure and naive. But I think it just speaks to her beauty coming from within, because ultimately that's what saves her, and that's what defeats her stepmother, is her purity of spirit, not her looks.
That's a great distinction. And it brings us to discuss how she was kind of naive, because the queen kept, that's another moral of the story, is being innocent and naive to that degree where the queen tries 3 separate times to come for her. And after each time, the 7 men say, listen, do not let anyone in this house, blah, blah, blah. So then the queen says, you know, oh, I won't come in. I'll stand out here. And I love the poison comb that she gives her as one. And in the 87 canon version, Canon Film Company version, when she comes with the comb, she's dressed in full geisha dress, and it's actually horrifying. It's kind of offensive. It really is. I mean, at the time, probably not, but looking back, it's this very like she's Asian voice, like very. It's not well done, but that's like another fable is be careful who you trust, I think, and because every time the queen comes, she's essentially a different person to Snow White. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, because I was thinking about it more, and there's a time jump, because Snow goes to the cottage with the 7 little men, and then she grows up more. In some of these adaptations, you see that when the queen comes back, she's suddenly older now. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, that's not really in the original story so much, but they did that in several where, you know, time has gone by.
Yeah.
If you look at one of the adaptations, she's like significantly older. She's a kid when she runs away, and then all of a sudden she's significantly older. So it makes more sense that she wouldn't remember what the queen as much. But
I mean, it's also, you know, the be careful who you trust thing also plays out with the dwarves, because they're scared of her in the Disney version. They're scared of her when they first find her sleeping in their bed, and Grumpy is having none of it. Okay, like, excuse you, sir. Grumpy is having none of it. He's like, listen, I'm not here for her feminine wiles and her trickery.
They say monster, or possibly maybe it's a monster, right?
Yeah, he does at one point. Yeah. So, I mean, there's skepticism there, and obviously, they're a little bit more not worldly, but, have experienced the real world, where, we have to remember she's 14 in the Disney movie. This is a child. She's a princess. She's completely sheltered, which again speaks to the fact that she would be seduced by things that she hasn't seen. And the comb, the corset, well, she'd seen a corset, I'm sure, but like a comb or this beautiful, delicious apple, and just having no experience interacting with humans probably outside of the court. So, I don't know.
Yeah, like, they're comforts for her, because it harkens back to her old life of comfort, is now living a very poor existence, meager existence, with nothing to call her own, no possession, right? So it's a temptation. Like, here's a shiny possession that's definitely a temptation.
And that word, Chad, is the perfect segue into the apple, because the apple is the literal embodiment of temptation in the narrative and in Christianity. The references to the garden and to Eve and the serpent are all there. The apple is the ultimate icon of Snow White, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say it's certainly the most famous, right? And I love how in the original fairy tale, the queen has bewitched the apple so that the redder half is the poison half, and the more yellow half has no poison in it. So she tricks her by saying, well, I get it, you don't want to trust me. Why don't we split this apple, and I'll have it with you, and I'll show you that, it's fine. I'll eat it too. But of course, Snow White doesn't realize that half of it is poison and half of it is not.
Right.
So really being careful of who you trust, and people who are deceitful.
One of the brilliant choices, animation-wise and just storytelling-wise, that the Disney version executes so well is when Snow White falls, not dead, but falls into her deathless sleep after having taken that bite of the apple. You don't see her eat it. You don't see her fall. You just see her arm as she hits the ground and the apple roll out of it, and it's all in shadow, and the music is building and building, and the relationship of movement and music in these older Disney animated classics is just so, again, simply elegant and beautiful. And I just think that's, like, dare I say, iconic. It's an iconic shot of just her hand and then the apple rolling out of it. And yeah, it's stunning.
And Disney did away with the whole, like, I love the concept in the original fairy tale that little piece of apple that is poison is something in her that she's spell and cough back up, and that when she coughs it back up, she can come back, to life, because that's the thing that has bewitched her, that has poisoned her, that's there. But it just the concept of that you got to get it out of you, and of course they don't show that in the Disney version, right? But they have it in Tale of Terror and some of the other versions, and in the original story she has to out.
It's a stark contrast to, the true love's kiss being what wakes her up, so you have the two very different cures to, her malaise. And, the true love's kiss is, who doesn't love that? I mean, we've all been programmed by Disney and Disney princess narratives and fairy tales. We can blame the Brothers Grimm as well. So, we all want our knight in shining armor. Some of us have, hopefully learned better, but it's still very much programmed into us to respond to that. So it's interesting to see which adaptations stick to that trope versus subvert it. And that's why I liked the choice that they made in Snow White and the Huntsman to have the Huntsman's kind of platonic love and respect for her act as true love, much like they did in the live action Maleficent, which I thought was masterfully done, where again, it's not the romantic interest who wakes her up, it's Maleficent who is her real true love. I like when they put a different spin on what true love is too.
I'm halfway there with you, because I love when we get a new take on something, but it pains me so much that this has never been done as a live action. It's 100% faithful.
Can we please get it right once?
Yes, just at least once with like a decent budget. And I'll give like a great example of where I think it was done really well was Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, which I think is very faithful and very rich in the costuming and Gary Oldman, and just it's not a perfect film by any means, but it's just a really well done adaptation that is so faithful in the feel to the original.
Yes.
And had that healthy budget and was just really enjoyable. Now the audiences just don't seem interested in that. It's more about like, how do you spin it so that it's trendy, or it fits a narrative, fits into a formula that is more successful than that story could be on its own.
Right.
I despise that, because I feel like the story is what has the power, not whatever fleeting cultural thing is happening. Not that those things can't come into it, but it's a tricky area.
Take us to church. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, what makes these things last hundreds of years, whether they be fairy tales dating back to Grimm's or even, folklore before that, the reason why these same stories keep getting told by different storytellers, whether it be Disney or whomever, is because they all have a hero's journey. They kind of have that fundamental map, but they're just excellent stories that embody the human condition and that everyone can relate to. And I'm not talking about like representation or anything like on the more political or modern scale, but just fundamental things that everyone can relate to. Envy, right. Jealousy, pining for someone, love, the death of a mother, the death of a child, universal archetypal experiences. And when they're overcomplicated or too many, like to your point, when it's too workshopped, it's too marketed, it's too packaged for the box office, you get these overcomplications, like the feminist backstory, like, okay, cool, yeah, sure, here for it, but also like it doesn't need that to stand on its own,
It's like, I like when something gets flipped on its head and it's the smart way, but it's just tricky. I mean, tricky.
Yeah, and I think Maleficent is another good example of that, because it was an extremely feminist narrative without being overtly feminist. It didn't have to do what Snow White and the Huntsman did and be like, oh, she's out to get all men. I mean, rightfully so, but it didn't have to do that. It just had to have this beautiful love between this mother figure and this daughter figure, and the message came through like much louder than it did in Snow White and the Huntsman.
Yes, we definitely need good writing. We need good storytellers, like you said. Storytelling is, I mean, we used to have people who were literally, their profession was storyteller. Like way back centuries ago, you had literal storytellers. That's what they did with their life. They were storytellers. And it was a craft that was like honed and like 24/7. That's what they did. And I just feel like we've lost that tradition in a lot of ways, or that we're losing it maybe in real time, and it feels terrible. Especially
in the West, especially in like the modern West. A lot of us, we never even had it in the modern West, but we certainly are losing. The cords are being severed left, right, and center, and the storytelling that is happening, sadly, we've talked about this, ad infinitum, is, focus grouped, and it's simply it's a commodity, and it's meant for consumption, and capitalism, capitalism, capitalism. But there is still good storytelling going on. Walt Disney Company, they have their hits and their misses, but I think they're still ultimately really good stewards of storytelling in general.
Yeah, I mean, I like Princess and the Frog was amazing to me. That's a way that you can take something, update it, but sacrifice nothing, right?
Right.
And you're giving us a Black Disney princess, which is something we should have had a long time ago, by all means. But it's just done so well. Like, I just thought that was an incredible film. And we'll get to it. Wasn't that, I believe, the last hand-drawn film, too, that they did?
I think so, yeah.
And amazing, beautiful, and I think she was like a really important and beautiful like addition to that line of Disney princesses. Well, a long time coming, finally. But like, that's an example where you can introduce those new cultural norms, or do things in a different way, rather than to like introduce a cool new narrative like feminism or that angle or any kind of other angle. It's just done about the bottom line, like what's gonna get attention and make it like popular in the moment, and because it will make more money. So really, if you trace it back, it's just decisions that are all money based. And when it's an art form, those are not creative or artistic decisions. It's just about the bottom line. I feel like in a capitalist society, things just get more and more about shareholders and money. The more a company like that grows, and the more we get savvy with how to manipulate people through social media, through media, and it's sad to see.
And you just actually named something that I may have been thinking of, but I would never have been able to name it, and you just did, so thank you. But this idea that in modern storytelling, the storytellers, maybe not the storytellers, but the money men behind the storytellers are focused on making something that is relevant and will work now because money. Okay, but if we go back in time and look at something like Snow White, they didn't have that type of pressure, right? And so they weren't trying to make sure that this was going to be relevant now. And that's the problem, is when you try and make something relevant for now, how can it ever be timeless?
Yes.
It's going to date, it's going to become irrelevant, and it's not going to hold, it's not going to be able to carry a story or a narrative or a myth forward, because it's too small of a container.
Absolutely. And I feel like the ramping up of the 24-hour news cycle and social media and everything has just really damaged storytelling, because storytelling used to be so much more lasting. Like you're saying, like things were told over centuries and retold and told, and that was how history was recorded, and that's how people pass down legend. And it's totally different now. But I feel like in this case of Snow White, as much as they needed funding for this project, Disney did, there was so much more of a separation between the men who were providing the money and Disney and his team of creators, right? Which were in the bubble of, how do we make this film as incredible as it can be? And then you have money and studio separate for the most. And now you see a lot less of that. You see a lot more of the studio calling the set, the studio installing someone on set to be there during production, reporting back every single night, stuff like that, through ramping up through the late 70s, 80s, 90s, and now just being completely out of control.
And it'll be interesting as we progress through these movie hours for the Disney classics, to see when that starts to shift for the Walt Disney Company, because it inevitably does.
Yes.
But one of the things that Disney has going for it that other things don't necessarily have, is it has its literal own world to accompany its art. So you have the movies, you have music, you have merchandise, but you literally have the theme parks where you can go and live this experience, like we talked about with the classic dark rides and the attention to theming and imagineering, and just, which is an art in and of itself. And I just was reminded of the moment in the cabin with the dwarves where Snow makes Grumpy gooseberry pie. And one of the most amazing experiences that I've had on Disney property, I was born and raised in Orlando, so I was very privileged to grow up going to the parks. So if you are ever able to go or have been and are going again, there's the most amazing experience that at Disney World. The resort, the Wilderness Lodge, has a restaurant called Artist Point, and it's a themed dining experience around Snow White. The restaurant's absolutely stunning. I'll insert a clip of me and my niece there. It's a prefix menu. It's very fancy. It's really delicious food. You get Snow, you get the Evil Queen, Dopey and Grumpy come and eat with you. And the final dessert is they serve you a mini gooseberry pie in the Evil Queen's heart box. And it's like presented with dry ice, and it's absolute magic. And that is why, like, those details, that's why people keep going to the parks. And that's why these things, something like Snow White, will stand the test of time, not only because it was already a very famous myth and folklore and fairy tale well before Disney got its hands on it, but because Walt Disney Company has maintain such great stewardship of that narrative.
Presentation is everything, and that's something that has surprised me over the decades, that they haven't allowed that to deteriorate to the degree it could have. Right. Of course, maybe the parks aren't perfect, like we discussed before, but I feel like the whole of the parks and that environment has been held up and has had caretakers ensure that it kind of aligns with the vision that Walt had for it. Mm-hmm. Way better than I could have ever hoped, right? Because Walt is long from this world, but you still feel him there at the parks. You still feel that the people who have been in charge, and there's some great documentaries that you can watch online about the CEOs and the changing of power throughout the years of Disney as a company and how it has been run. But I feel that more or less they've done a really good job of trying to honor the feeling that he wanted for the parks and the vision that he had for the parks, except for Norway.
Yeah. Epcot is having a moment. She's having a moment, and we're very nervous for her, but.
Well, and you would think, like we talked about with capitalism and with money and wanting to make money, that they would have flipped these things even quicker almost, and just really
we need to take, those of us that are hardcore Disney fans need to really take stock and appreciate what is there, because it may not be there forever, and they are putting less and less money, even pre-COVID, into Imagineering and theme park budgets. So a lot of what made those parks what they are may not be there, 20, 50 years down the line. So enjoy it while you can, I suppose. And, if you have the opportunity to go to Disneyland, do Disneyland, because they have all the classic dark rides, Peter Pan, Snow White, Mr. Toad, Pinocchio. They have the classics. And Walt actually walked those streets, and it has very, very different energy than our home park, which is, of course, beautiful and in and of itself, and was what he wanted to have happen. He was doing the Florida project, at the time that he passed, and Epcot was his final vision. So We're certainly very protective of it, but yeah, there's definitely an energy when you walk down Main Street in Disneyland that's very palpable.
And it strikes you like how much, if you're used to Disney World, Disneyland feels so much smaller, but in the best possible way. I mean, it just feels so much more quaint and so much more of that atmosphere that they were going for.
Yes, it's apples and oranges. I don't think it's fair to ever compare them.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, they're both amazing. And to your point, Disneyland is, you can feel, I mean, at the risk of sounding super cheesy, I don't care because this is my truth. Like, you can feel Walt. You can feel that love that he put into it, and that all of these Imagineers and cast members and, you know, construction workers and artists put in over the decades. Like, you can feel it.
Because we're kicking off our Disney series, and this is our 34th, if I'm correct, movie hour that we've done. So just to kick off this series that's going to be forthcoming on Disney animated features, what are your top Disney animated features of all time?
Yeah, I was scared you were going to ask me this again. So after having prayed on this, okay, so this is, WALL-E isn't kind of a subcategory because it's Pixar, but WALL-E's one of my favorite. It's my favorite Pixar.
I love WALL-E.
Very controversial. I recognize that, and I recognize that it is super problematic. But in terms of little Melissa growing up and my memories and the good things that I took from it, Song of the South.
Yes, and the ride, Splash Mountain, tied in, you know, themed. Yeah. That was such a big part of my life as well. One of my favorite rides of all time. You can't control what is your nostalgia. I mean, that for you, that was at a very important time in your life. And, you know, all of us have problematic things. If you're a woman of a particular age, as Wendy Williams would say, then, you know, you have these things that you have gone through in cultural times, and we took only good things from them, thankfully, but they are problematic.
Yeah, sadly, it's a very problematic film, but
they need to just put it on Disney. Is that terrible to say? Is that very problematic for me to say? But it should be on Plus, because I mean, it's
yes, you and I are in agreement that it should not be censored.
I'm all for the warning that they have on there, and I'm all for parents using it as a teaching tool. You sent me a great article about a parent that uses these things as a teaching tool. Like, hey, look at how silly we were and how ignorant or how horrible this was.
Yeah, I certainly don't think it needs to be, it should be in production in terms of pumping out new copies of it. No. Yeah. And as much as I'm sad to see Splash Mountain go, I understand 100% why it has to. But, you know, I don't think that it should be censored. I don't think it should be like unavailable to purchase or to find. But again, you know, that's also a much larger conversation. You know, we are two white people speaking from our experience, and although it wasn't traumatic and triggering to us in the same ways that it would be to, you know, little boys and girls of color that grew up when we did, or, you know, if young boys and girls of color were to watch it now, it would probably, they would probably say something very different. But yes. Yeah, I still don't agree with it being, you know, permanently in the vault, so to speak. But yeah, Song of the South is always gonna like live in my heart. And I don't know, I mean, Oliver and Company, Bambi, in terms of live action classic Disney, The Bear, Cheetah, I think those are up there for me. And Little Mermaid is like, in terms of like a modern, and the Disney Renaissance period, Little Mermaid. All right, hit me with yours.
If you can't tell by my shirt, And we are going to count it as even though it was more of a video, right? It was not
We make the rules here, people.
Okay. So my number one is Adventures of is Mr. Toad. The full title is Ichabod and the Mr. Toad. This is my number one, and my number two. Okay, my number two is Sleeping Beauty.
That's an excellent number two.
And my number three would be Alice in Wonderland. Now my honorable mentions would be Jungle Book.
Jungle Book has some of the most amazing music in it.
Yes, I just found it delightful, and at the time, you know, I was very, very young when I saw it. So
Jungle Book is also one that has had various adaptations. So I can't wait to get into that, because some of the adaptations I think have done justice to the original, where other adaptations for other movies fall so short. So yeah, and speaking of Pinocchio, which is going to be our next one, we are moving in chronological order, so we will finish this probably around the time that we die.
Yes.
Well, I wanted to just say one closing thing in relation to Snow White and some of the people behind it. I found out a fun fact, which is that there were 150 individual ink and paint portraits to make up the film. Just ink and paint. There were 1 million drawings in total to comprise Snow White.
That's insane.
Isn't that like too much to process?
It is. And there's so much magic in something that is physically drawn in that way, where they were literally touching the paper. It's literally hand drawn. I just think that there's just so much magic in that.
Yeah, I mean, art form aside, technical prowess aside, yes. Like when you watch an older animated film, Disney or otherwise, and you I mean, just the texture, the aesthetic of it, you're feeling that it was touched. You're feeling that it was a tactile, kinetic thing that came to life, which you don't get in the more modern digital animation or Pixar. I just wanted to shout out, I'm very obsessed with Imagineering. The Imagineering story on Disney Plus is a must-watch documentary if you're interested in Disney and U.S. history, art history. One of the things it's lacking, though, is a lot of attention to the women of Walt Disney Animation, Walt Disney Company, and Walt Disney Imagineering. They mentioned Mary Blair very briefly, but I've been obsessed with these women, and I've been trying to learn as much as I can, and unfortunately there's not a lot out there. There is one book I will link in the description called The Queens of Animation by Natalia Holt, about the women who worked in the original ink and paint department at Walt Disney Studios. And one just interesting fact that I learned from the documentary is that once the animation was done and it would go to ink and paint to become colorized, Disney Studios custom mixed every single color that you see in Snow White themselves. Like those are all custom mixed colors, which I had no idea. 1,500 original shades make up the Snow White color. And the women of ink and paint actually would put actual rouge on the cells when they were painting Snow White's face. And Walt was like, why are you doing this? And they were like, why do you think? Like, we know where it goes. We do this every day. So when you see Snow White in the movie, that's real blush on the actual animation cell.
I had no idea. That's mind-blowing. Well, you'll have to share more details about these incredible women as we progress through our series, and and
so excited.
Have a guest or two on and of some sort, and it'll be an interesting. I'm looking forward to it.
Yes, well, I hope we did Snow and her Seven Dwarfs justice. I think we did. If you guys know of anything, trivia, tidbits, history that we didn't mention or don't know about, please comment. That would be amazing. And yes, we invite you to subscribe as always. And I'll link the playlist for the female Imagineers, and I guess we will see you on the other side with Pinocchio.
Can't wait.
Cheers.